just to explain really quickly this handout and how it kind of fits. It's in several different parts. The first part is a basic timeline of the period, kind of give you some sense of the context that he's coming into, this context that Garvey's walking into. The next section talks about some of the major trends in black thought, black protests. Then at the bottom there's some background information on Garvey, although the textbook talks about this, especially chapter 15, and the documentary talks about it as well. And then the last part are going to be some quotes. I want to go through these quotes really quickly to give you some sense of Garvey's message and how he was received. But these are going to be really important. He's known as a Pan-Africanist, right? Essentially what Garvey does is, part of what he does is really make this connection. Think about a concept like imagined community. Right? He's saying, look, the imagined community is not just black people in the U.S. or black people in Jamaica or black people in Nigeria. He says they all have something in common. So they need to come together and empower themselves. He says part of the problem is that it's so divided that they're able to be manipulated, right? So this idea of Pan-Africanism basically is the idea that all black people have something in common and should use that to empower themselves. Right, so that's, you see the first Pan-African Congress there in 1900. It was in London. Du Bois was actually one of the people at that meeting. People start thinking about, blackness kind of beyond one nation's border. This is going to be very important to Garvey's movement. Remember, up from slavery, 1901, sold to black folk, 1903. You saw in the video that Garvey reads Up From Slavery in 1914. And it kind of blows his mind. He says, this is perfect. He initially thinks, I can take this model and bring it back to Jamaica. I can basically make a larger form of Tuskegee, where we do for ourselves, we build our own bricks and buildings and empower oneself economically and free ourselves that way. He's very drawn to Booker T. Washington's ideas of self-reliance, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, self-determination, economic power, which might be surprising in some ways. For many, it's surprising that he's so drawn to Booker T. Washington and not to a Du Bois. In part because Washington, as we know, the other side of that coin for Washington was kind of accommodation to race, right? Not try to vote, not try to challenge yourself in the system, right? Not try to, or maybe even more importantly, was Washington's view of African American identity. Remember, Booker T. Washington was saying, in terms of that whole African American problem, the hyphen that Du Bois talks about. Remember, Washington was saying, don't worry about the African side, just be the best American you can be. So some folks are surprised that Garvey is so drawn to Washington, because Garvey in some ways is kind of the opposite in terms of the role of black culture. Right? Garvey's going to talk a lot about black culture and African culture and how Africans were descended from a race of kings and powerful civilizations that existed when Europeans were running around in caves. Like, these are the type of speeches he would make. So again, Washington would have been into all that. Garvey was into that. But he also was into Washington's kind of economic piece. He thought that piece was something that could be very useful. So his organization is going to be very involved in the kind of economics of it. Many people think that he might have been drawn more to Du Bois. Remember, Du Bois is talking about you have to, stand up for your manhood and vote, defend yourself in these certain ways. Like, Garvey's going to be very much about a new Negro manhood and defending the race. Right, as going to see here in a second in a couple of the quotes. Very much about Pan-Africanism, like Du Bois was. But Garvey and Du Bois butt heads, seriously butt heads. Seriously butt heads. Now remember, Garvey comes to the U.S., he just misses Washington, because Washington dies in 1915. So remember, Du Bois and Washington were going back and forth. Du Bois just kind of ascended because Washington now is gone. The very next year, Garvey's here, and they're both in New York. They're both in Harlem Central. Du Bois is one of the heads of the NAACP. Garvey with this new organization that's going to be developed, the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. So they're really going to be in some ways in competition, but they're really going to butt heads. And I'll give you a couple of quotes that explain that. You might think they might have been able to get along well, but they are not going to be able to do so. Now, there may be some reasons for this. Garvey comes and he is very successful. After this first speech that you saw where he really has some trouble, right? Professor Hill talks about Garvey falling off the stage and his voice trembling and stuff that first time. He was not a good speaker at first. He makes himself into a great speaker. He studies Billy Sunday, studies others, and makes himself into this captivating speaker that thousands of black folks will come. He could pack the house. How popular was this UNIA organization? He comes to the Parliament in 1916. By about 1919, there are between 2 and 6 million members of the UNIA worldwide. Between 2 and 6 million members. Seen as the largest black nationalist organization in history. Only been here 3 years. There's something about his message, there's something about his presence that people are drawn to. And maybe it was in part timing, right? He's walking right into this whole new Negro spirit. Representation is particularly important. You see a lot of images of Garvey, right? He's always in this uniform, right? The hat. Black men in particular always wore these uniforms that looked like military uniforms in a sense. They came with a sword. Right? These folks are serious. When they march down the street, people are like, oh, okay, this is serious. Blacks felt that way, and whites too. Like, what is this? You got a couple thousand black men in uniforms with swords walking down the street talking about, Africa is the cradle of civilization. Europe had to come learn from us, which is all true. Right? But for them to be saying it in 1919 and 1920 was seen as very radical, and for some, very scary. This did not sound like Booker T. Washington accommodation at all. I'll give you some more examples of that. So Garvey kind of walks into this, right? Randolph helped put him on, and he really explodes in terms of his popularity. Black women have a prominent role in the organization. We saw Amy Ashwood, his first wife, helped found the UNIA in Jamaica. One of his later wife, Amy Jacques Garvey, is also going to help spread the message. There were prominent women in the organization, although there was some trouble around gender. Should you have traditional gender roles, right? Because a lot of what Garvey was talking about was traditional black manhood, taking care of your family and these sorts of things. But what did that mean in terms of control of women versus empowering women? But there were women leaders, for example. Important in terms of its gender dynamic too. You'll see a lot of that represented in the rest of that documentary that you should watch. It's only the first 17, 18 minutes that I played for you. It's an hour, 20 minutes long. What was he saying? What was he saying? What was he talking about? I want you to turn to the back page where it says slogans and quotes. Right? Garvey becomes known for several slogans. The first one is Africa for the Africans, Africa for Africans. Right? He said, look, Africa has been colonized, as we mentioned before, right, going back to the 1880 Berlin Conference. It's been carved up by Europe. He says, we got to deal with that. He says, you'll never be respected wherever you are in the world if your homeland is not respected. So we need to reconquer Africa and make it this great place, the great place that it was, kick Europeans out. In fact, he says, not only do we need to do that, but we need to all go back there. Right? So the second quote, this UNIA movement was a back to Africa movement. He said, we need to get out of this country. You Americans, black Americans need to get out of the U.S. Let's all go back to Africa and make it this powerful empire. Then we'll see how we're treated. Have a powerful government, have a military, and empower ourselves economically, kind of along the lines of the Tuskegee model. He wanted himself to be president. A provisional president of Africa was one of the titles he talked about, kind of unifying this massive continent. Remember, Africa is huge, right? 3.5 times the size of the U.S. So if it could all be unified, you could argue that it could be this very powerful force, right? And that all people of color could be respected based on that. So these slogans and these quotes are particularly interesting. I want you to think about how they might be received in 1916 or in this whole New Negro era. How black people might hear this and how whites might hear this. Garvey talked a lot about history. He used history and its importance. He said that part of black people's problems is they didn't know their history. It's going to be very significant when you think about later individuals like Malcolm X. A lot of the same messages. And there's a direct connection between Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X. Direct connection between those two in their black nationalism, in a sense. What is that connection? Well, Malcolm X's father was a black Baptist minister who was also a UNIA member. He went to various meetings about this Back to Africa movement and black nationalism, Sometimes he took a young Malcolm X with him to these meetings. So there's interesting how there's this direct connection between the black nationalism of the 1920s and what we would see with the 50s and 60s with Malcolm X. He was talking about black nationalism at that moment. So one of the other quotes I want to point out, look at the first quote. One of the things we'll notice about black nationalist figures as opposed to, say, an integrationist figure like Du Bois. Remember, Du Bois is saying, look, we need to struggle and get our right to vote to ultimately be accepted into American society, ultimately be accepted into white society. Garvey's like, that's ridiculous. You'll never be accepted. You should leave. Forget trying to get accepted. Forget trying to force your way into American society. Go somewhere else. They don't want you. And it's sick for you to try to fit yourself into some place where you're not wanted. Now, in some respects, maybe this is another way that Garvey saw himself as connected with Washington. Remember, Washington was saying, no, don't force yourself in there. Develop your own little separate economy. Right? Ultimately, you can gain respect, but be separate. Separate as the fingers, right? So Garvey pulled on that part of it. But it's interesting to think about this kind of black nationalist message. If you have the Washington-Du Bois debate on one hand, right, separation and then empowerment versus integration, Garvey's like, I'm really going to throw both of them away. Neither one of them had, or both of them had the goal of integrating ultimately into American society. Garvey says that's ridiculous. You shouldn't even try to do that. All right, let's go back to Africa. So a lot of what you'll hear in Garvey is not only criticism of white racism, but just as importantly, and you often see this with black nationalist thinkers and speakers, you're going to hear criticism of African Americans too. He says a lot of the fault for the problems that black people have is on black people. So look at a couple of these quotes. I want to see what you think about them. The first one says, Africa was peopled with a race of cultured black men who were masters in art, science, and literature. Men who were, I wrote that twice. Cultured and refined men who it was said were like the gods. Black men, you were once great, you shall be great again. So again, it's a direct challenge to this whole Sambo stereotype. He's going to say, look, African Americans, you think your history started with slavery, but you have a history going back thousands of years and a great history of building civilizations and such, at a moment when Europe was much less advanced than Africa. Europeans go study in Africa to learn things. So he's going to say, look, if you were once great, you can be great again. And especially this reference to history. Look at the second one, though. The second one, you might see this very critical of African Americans. He says, we have outgrown slavery, but our minds are still enslaved to the thinking of the master race. Now take these kinks out of your mind instead of out of your head. So again, think about how this might fit into the time period, right? Especially in kind of 1920s, you saw a lot of hair straightening and that kind of stuff. He says, look, you guys are concerned about straightening your hair, and a lot of folks would say, looking more like whites, blah, blah, blah. Again, some folks reject that. But he says, look, you're more worried about that instead of worried about freeing yourself from the mental slavery that's holding you back. All right, so this is directed not at the white community, but at the black community. What do you think of that quote? How do you think that quote would have been received by African Americans at the time, say 1919, 1920? What do you think of that quote? How might it be received now? It might be seen as just as radical today. No reaction? All right, we'll move on. Look at the third quote. That the Negro race became a race of slaves was not the fault of God Almighty, it was the fault of the race. Once again, you often hear black nationalists who, although are very critical of white supremacy and racism, tend to be just as critical of blacks and how they've responded to it or failed to respond to it in their view. If you listen to early Malcolm X speeches, he is harsh on everybody. He talks about the white devils and the white people smell like dogs, that kind of stuff, kind of reversing stereotypes. But he's also very harsh on blacks. He says, you spineless black man that'll let yourself be beaten and turn the other cheek and all that. He's just as harsh on the black community. He said, look, you need to stand up and be men. Very similar to what we're going to see in the 1920s, and very similar to some of the critique that Garvey is going to bring to the African American community. Here he says, look, the fact that you were slaves, it's not God's fault. And you can't just blame whites. You took it. Now again, you can challenge this in some ways, right? There always was resistance to slavery. You know, folks fought and died, throughout the process trying to, resist it. But you can understand the point he's making, right? He says, look, if you fight to the death, you won't be a slave regardless. And that's your problem continuing. You get lynched because you allow yourself to be lynched. In fact, at one point, Garvey says, okay, if they lynch one African American person in the U.S., we should lynch 2 white people in Africa. He writes this in 1920. For every one they lynch, we should lynch 2. Very radical message for the time. You can imagine how white America would receive, like, wait a second, this guy is saying it on just white people. Couple that with the fact that he has thousands of people marching down the street with swords and military uniforms, millions of people in this organization. A lot of folks get really nervous when Mr. Marcus Garvey comes to the U.S. and within 3 years has this massive organization.
You said a lot of white people nervous.
You nervous? Yeah, he scares people to death because he didn't sound like a Booker T. Washington, right? He didn't sound like don't try to vote, just work hard, pull yourself up. He was saying, be a man. If they're going to kill you, make sure that they try to kill you, make sure they can't ever kill anybody else. If they lynch one of us, we'll lynch 2 of them. That would be radical even today. That was radical when Malcolm X was saying some of the things in the 50s and 60s. Very radical in 1919 or 1920 during, say, a Bloody Summer or a race riot. Couple that with the fact that he wasn't American. Who's this outsider going to step in here and say, we should lynch 2 for every one? But the fact that he was so popular tells you something too. Right? Black people are like, this guy is great. Listen to what he's saying. He's talking about a new Negro. He's very much identified with this idea of a new Negro rather than an old Negro. So the black masses love Garvey. Hugely popular. Give you some sense of how popular. Du Bois at this point is one of the leaders of the NAACP. Du Bois is the editor of the Crisis magazine, which was the newspaper of the NAACP. That newspaper, seen as very popular, had a circulation of about 50,000 people. 50,000 people bought the Crisis every week and read it. Right? Now that didn't mean that only 50,000 people read it. Usually people read it and handed it off to a friend, so it was actually a little more than that. But 50,000 was seen as good for the NAACP. Garvey's organization has between 2 and 6 million. And he's only been here 3 years. So black leaders also are like, who is this dude coming in here? He's going to take all our support, right? There may have been some insecurity among black leaders too. So couple this radical message with the fact that he was seen as a challenge to established and traditional black leaders, including A. Philip Randolph, who helped him kind of get on, and later on they get into some conflict. But especially Garvey and Du Bois get into some conflict. I mentioned earlier that they butt heads. Some of it's going to be very unfortunate. Some of it's going to be very unfortunate, but the way that they would come at each other was problematic, I'll say that. I'll give you an example. A lot of the debate between them becomes this kind of mudslinging, this cracking on each other, attacking each other, but a lot of it had to do with racial stuff too. For example, Du Bois was a lighter-skinned African-American leader. Right? Garvey was this darker-skinned leader from Jamaica. And some of that came out in their back and forth. So at one point, Garvey says of Du Bois, he's like a piss-colored, sellout, Uncle Tom Negro, basically. It's pretty harsh. Du Bois came back just as harsh and called him this crazy Jamaican monkey. So they're really going at, like if they had seen each other in the street, it might have been a fight. At one point, Du Bois says, this guy is crazy. He's a crazy man. And Du Bois really felt like he had a crazy plan that was going to come here and really upset things and possibly destroy the progress that had been made. Now remember, this sounds a lot similar to what we saw earlier with Washington and Du Bois. Remember, they both feel like the other might be a threat or might have the wrong plan. So even though they had some respect for each other, they thought each was dangerous. Right? Now there were some things that Garvey does that really gets him into hot water. Some things that he does that really gets him into hot water. I want to get to that in a second here. I'll read this last quote real quick, and then we'll get into that. Garvey says, "We must canonize our own saints, create our own martyrs, and elevate to positions of fame and honor black men and women who have made their distinct contributions to our racial history." So, you need to have black heroes. You idolize everything the white community does, but you don't idolize your own black heroes. So a lot, again, using history a lot to sort of uplift racial pride and such. Right? A lot of people trace the kind of sort of origins of this kind of black is beautiful movement that we would see explode in the late 60s to Garvey. Garvey talks about not only how black was beautiful, as opposed to traditional stereotypes of black men and women as ugly. Right? Remember, the traditional reading was that blacks were inferior. Garvey actually reversed that. He said, you know what, not only are we not inferior, we're superior to whites. They're the ones that are inferior. Right? We had this great history long before they accomplished anything, right? So it's a really interesting message that he's going to put out there in terms of reversing some of the traditional stereotypes. Yet some see him as going too far. Some see Garvey as going too far. And now some of this has to do with his ultimate goals. Remember, Garvey's ultimate goal is not to integrate into U.S. society, not to integrate into white society. He thought that was foolishness, suicide. To leave, to go back to Africa. He actually is going to buy some ships, and a few people leave, not too many, but some people do leave and go back to Africa. This was his ultimate plan, to bring all people of African descent back to Africa. So keep that goal in mind in terms of some of the tactics that Garvey would develop. One thing in particular gets him into a whole bunch of trouble. And it's on the timeline here. If you look back at that handout in 1922, Garvey makes a decision that's going to get into some difficulties. 1922, Marcus Garvey decides to meet with the leadership of the Ku Klux Klan. He sits down with the Grand Dragon, Grand Wizard, whatever they call themselves, the main leader of the KKK, and says, let's talk. I want to get your impressions of this, what you think about this tactic or this strategy. From Garvey's perspective, he was like, yeah, I'll talk to him. He said, we have the same goal. The Klan wants all black people to leave the U.S. I want all black people to leave the U.S. So let's sit down and see if I can get them to write me a check. And we'll work it out. How different, Garvey might argue, how different is that from a wealthy white industrialist that don't really like black people, that wrote checks to Booker T. Washington for him to do with what he needed to uplift the community? He says, look, if the Klan's going to write me a check, I'll take it from them or anybody else. He sits down for this meeting in 1922, and black leaders lose their mind. Now remember, Du Bois and Garvey and these other leaders are already having tension. Imagine when word gets back, Marcus Garvey is sitting down with the Klan to kind of determine the future destiny of African Americans. This guy's not African American, he's from Jamaica, right? So some see him as an outsider anyway. This is when this is when Du Bois writes this article, Marcus Garvey is either a lunatic or a traitor, right? It's like question mark. He's either a lunatic or a traitor. He says, I don't know which one he is. He's either crazy or he's a traitor to the race. Either way, he's the most dangerous person in the country. That was Du Bois' view. Garvey's view was like, it makes perfect sense. What do you think about that strategy? How do you think that might go over in 1922? This leader of African Americans sitting down with the Klan, right? This organization we've seen before, known for lynching folks and doing all this kind of stuff. Does it make sense or does it not make sense? How do you think that would work? What are your impressions?
I think again, working at the time, especially at the time, mentioning current. I'm just thinking back, we were talking about what happened in 1920.
Yeah.
And all that. And I'm just thinking back all these race riots in like 1917, race riots and stuff like that. That was crazy.
Yeah. Particularly for that moment, right? You have race riot, bloody summer of 1919. Race riots at an all-time high. But from Garvey's perspective, he's like, look, they're showing you that they don't like you. You keep trying to integrate, and they keep killing you. Let's go ahead and make a move. Like, let's go. I have a plan. I'm not afraid to sort of to do it. But you can definitely see how folks might respond to this plan. Now, what happens? Now, Garvey has started to make enemies, right, among black leaders and among the white community. Right? A lot of folks are scared of him. The U.S. government, many of the governments of Europe, right? Because he's talking about a worldwide movement of black people. So governments in London and France are like, whoa, what's going on with this? Remember, especially during World War I, all these African colonies, they need to help fight World War I. Right? Garvey's talking about, why are you fighting for them? Why don't you fight for your own nation? So Garvey has made some pretty powerful enemies, and you're going to see certain things start to happen. Government surveillance, for example. Right? The organization that later becomes the FBI takes notice of Mr. Garvey. There would be the first black FBI agent is hired to infiltrate the UNIA and kind of spy on Garvey and find out, what's going on, maybe start messing with him. A young, up-and-coming FBI agent by the name of J. Edgar Hoover, who later becomes head of the FBI, makes his career on kind of undermining Marcus Garvey's organization and kind of breaking him down. Later, the same J. Edgar Hoover would be the one in charge of the FBI when the FBI would, tap Martin Luther King's phones and Malcolm X's phones and destabilize the Black Panthers. All the stuff that happens in the 60s, J. Edgar Hoover is the one in charge of that. He kind of makes his name 40 years earlier messing with radicals, especially black radicals like Marcus Garvey. So Garvey begins to find himself, under the attention of folks that he was particularly dangerous. Government's kind of out to get him, basically. But there's a problem with that. Not only is the government out to get him, but other black leaders, many of them are worried about him too. So when he does fall into trouble, people like the boys don't help him. So what ultimately happens? Garvey gets accused of mail fraud, the crime of mail fraud. It's charged with mail fraud. Basically, we told you he was starting his own shipping company, the Black Star Line. Black Star Line, modeled on the White Star Line, which is a major British shipping company. This Black Star Line was going to take blacks back to Africa. He buys about 3 ships, right, and kind of leaky, not great ships. He had bad advice on a lot of those financial decisions. But he gets these ships, and the way he pays for the ships was UNIA members send him money. So he ultimately gets accused of using the mail to defraud investors. Now, a lot of this has to do with bad advice. A lot of this had to do with black people stubborn or didn't want to listen to certain folks. But again, people were kind of out to get him too. And then once the government cracks down on him, a lot of black leaders in some of the black community that are upset about his meeting with the Klan, upset about various things, don't really come to his aid. He's going to be convicted of this crime. He goes to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and then is deported. Because remember, he's not a U.S. citizen, so they would deport him to kind of get him out of the country. 1927, he's deported. He goes back to Jamaica initially and then goes to London, where he would die in 1940 in London. So again, tremendous rise and fall. Some say the beginning of the fall might have been 1922 with that meeting with the Klan. Others point to the long-term significance, especially his kind of his race pride, his use of history, these sorts of things. I want you to think about how he fits perfectly in this notion of the new